All right. All right, everything's recording. One thing I learned from the first one was it's a little bit challenging for me to watch the chat screen and the questions while I'm talking. I'll try and do a better job this time, sort of trying to keep an eye on it. If I don't, if I miss any questions or there's something you asked, I do have the ability, and I can actually download the chat after I'm done, so I can see everything that was said while I was talking. So I may possibly just follow up with an email or contact you directly if you asked something and I didn't get a chance to answer it while I was presenting at the webinar. Don't be surprised if I send an email afterwards, because I download the chat and I have a document so I can see it, what everybody was saying when I'm not in the middle of presenting, which is kind of nice, but it's a little, I don't want to concern anybody if I follow up afterwards. I'll try and keep an eye though and stop and check periodically to make sure I'm keeping up with what everybody's asking me, so you can hear it while I'm presenting it. So what I want to talk about today is assessments and testing and all of that fun stuff. What I consider, I've been an instructional designer for 12 years. I've designed for large organizations. I've worked with law enforcement for 6 years. And I actually consider assessments one of the hardest parts of my job. It's very interesting, and sometimes it scares me a little bit when I see people who are very new to this, who are coming in as a subject matter expert and being asked to design training, and they're writing tests as one of the first things they're doing. I can attest, and I'm sure everybody who's actually written assessments and tests can tell you it's very, very tricky. It's really hard to get right, and it takes a lot of practice to get good at it. So it's something I think is really for more experienced designers, or something that really you should have some guidance with when you're relatively new to it. Although I have 8 years of university, all in adult education, there is courses dedicated totally to test writing. I don't have one, even in 2 certificates and now a master's degree in adult ed. I've never actually done a course purely based on assessments, but of course it's incorporated in numerous courses that I've taken over the years, and I'm still taking now. So this was the process that I covered last time for anybody who was at the last webinar or has watched the recording. This is my design process. It mirrors ADDIE and all the same, many of the models all sort of follow the same process. This is mine. So just to show where we are in the process today, by the time we're looking at assessments and assessment plans, you've done your needs analysis, you've written your course goal, you've actually defined all your learning outcomes, and you know what you want to achieve at the end of the course. And then you start looking at testing and what are we going to do? So how are we going to know we were successful in facilitating the content or meeting the learning outcomes that we had designed? So we're sort of right in the middle, but we haven't actually started designing the whole course yet, which I talked about in the last webinar as well. This is something that a lot of people, when you're new, you do it at the end, and then the more you design and the more efficient you get at it, you do learn to start doing your assessment components, or at least having a very good sense of what you're going to do for assessments before you actually start designing all the rest of the course. So why do we do assessments? This is something that's really evolved for me over the last 12 years. I used to always tell people very commonly that we test in order to cover our butts, so to speak. That we do it because if there's ever an inquiry or anybody comes in and says, something went wrong, how did you train these people? What did they do? And how do you know that they knew what you taught them when they were in the class? And we can pull out our assessments and we can say, here's our test. It shows you that we covered this content and that they knew it when they left the classroom. If something happened outside the classroom, that's not our fault, so to speak. There is some that's our fault, but in general, things change after they leave the classroom and we don't have a ton of control over that. And that's why I used to really believe that testing existed. And where that comes from is when we think back to, and for those of us with children, is standardized testing that we saw in school. Why did they bring about standardized testing? Although that was so they could start comparing and proving that kids were at this level or that level. And we basically train and design training based on the systems that we grew up in. So that was sort of my opinion about assessments. Now, as I've gone on and got more experienced and learned a lot more and really looked at assessments and evaluation and what we're doing, I've realized that that purpose, although we do need to serve that purpose, everybody here I know works for organizations, and we're all responsible for, accountable for what happens in our courses. We really miss the boat on why we actually want to be assessing learning. It serves so many purposes, so many more purposes, and when we don't look at all the reasons why we're doing it, we continue to do it wrong. One of the things that I'll talk about a little bit later, and where we miss the boat even on standardized testing for kids, is feedback and how beneficial assessments are for learning. There's tons of studies, there's all sorts of stuff out there, lots of research that shows if you use testing methods, people learn more, retain more, and it improves their recall than if you just sit there lecturing to them. So when we're testing, even through exercises and assessments, you're engaging the brain and they're getting involved in learning the content, which improves memory recall afterwards, after the course, and even on the job, that they will retain way more information if you engage them than if you just sit there talking and lecturing and doing what I'm doing right now. So it's there's a lot of theory behind this, and it's well-researched and documented theory about how to engage people in learning. And this is really what we should be using assessments for, is for the participant. It's about them. It's not really about the organization or about proving that we did this or we did that. It's really about them and how do we maximize our training. And I believe this is one of the ways that we can really improve the quality of our training and how successful we are in the end of meeting all of our learning objectives. So I'm just going to talk about the, there we go, the different assessment types. Because there's, like I said, this is a lot more involved, there's a lot more into it than we originally think when we first start out in training, especially for those of us who all came up as subject matter experts and got thrown into training positions with no background in this. So the first assessment type I'm going to talk about is pre-assessments. These, I've seen them used well and I've seen them used not so well, but a pre-assessment, by the name, is actually done at the beginning or before the course. These serve a lot of purposes. If you ever want to do a comparison of what they knew at the beginning and what they knew at the end after the training, you have to have a pre-assessment in order to be able to collect the data to actually have those statistics. You need to know, you need a benchmark of where they were before the course started. So that's one of the reasons we can use pre-assessments if we want to do a comparison. Other reasons, I primarily use them at the beginning of a class or even just a topic. When we introduce a new topic, we do a few pre-assessment questions. If anybody's done any of my online modules, they'll see that they all start with a 3-question pre-assessment. And the reason why I do that is because it gets people in the right mindset. You're sort of getting them into that topic, and they're starting to think about it. So they're processing in their mind, what do they already know about this topic? What are their experiences to this topic? And in order for learning to occur, one of the major theories in adult education is that we attach new information or compare it to what we already know. So using a pre-assessment conjures up all of that and gets people thinking about it. So in a way, you're getting them in the right mindset in order to cover the topic or the course. So these are very useful. One course I attended, I got to observe for the RCMP. They did one, it was actually on policy and procedure, and what did they already know, because it was a high-level informant handling course. So these people are all very experienced officers who've been out for quite a while. So they went back and they actually just did a test on the policies and procedures around handling confidential informants. And that's what they used to jump off the entire topic. So instead of just sitting there reading about, reading through the policies or talking on and on to slides full of text, because that's what happens when we present on policy, they started with the test. And then they went through each question and then they talked about it, and everyone could look, did I get it right? Did I get it wrong? And then they can actually talk about each policy as they hit the test question. It's far more engaging and way more interesting. I thought it was an excellent usage of pre-assessment, and one I've only ever actually seen done that way that one time. So I definitely, for anything that you think they should already know, sort of standard information, I guess, especially when we get into more advanced courses, pre-assessments are a great way to launch into your topic and make sure that everybody's sort of at the same location, at the same place when you get started. The next type is formative assessments. So these are done throughout the course. Basically, you're forming learning. So they're done throughout. So every time we cover a topic, or we do even a small part of a topic, a piece of content, and then we do an exercise afterwards, that's a form of formative assessment. Providing they're engaged and they're doing something. Sometimes you just ask questions and they write them down in the book, or you do some sort of group discussion and debrief on the discussion or scenarios, anything along those lines, and you're providing feedback on what they've said or what their responses are. That's a formative assessment. And this is where we can really start engaging people and building up our training so that we're making sure we cover something, they apply it, we give them feedback, make sure they've got it right, then we either cover something new or we cover something more advanced, feedback, did they get it right? And we keep going through that way until we get to the end. And the end is the summative assessment. So this is the one that we're used to. This is the test at the end. A lot of time there's an assigned pass grade. Sometimes it makes people very, very nervous. A lot of people have anxiety around testing because of our experiences, especially as children, sitting in gyms and doing these written tests. And there was so much on the line with the summative assessment that it really built up a lot of anxiety for people. I think if all your participants are that anxious about the end, then you probably didn't design your course very well. You should be preparing them for it. Through the formative assessments, through the content and the exercises, they should be ready for that summative assessment. I talked about it, I think, earlier on, and definitely again when I talk about writing test questions, but it's our job to set people up to succeed. We're not trying to trick them at the end or make sure that see who stands out on the very top. Our goal as instructional designers is to set everybody up to succeed. So your formative assessment should build up to your summative assessment, which is at the end. So I'm just going to give an example of a course I designed on interview and interrogation, and just show this is my actual documentation when I'm creating training, and I start, I do like a curriculum map, I list all my outcomes, and then I start working on my assessments according to the order that I showed you earlier. So we did one on cognitive interviewing, and this was a blended course, so they had to go and do an online module before they came. So they already had received information on the impacts of memory recall. And what we did, I did a pre-assessment. As soon as they came into the classroom, and luckily no one in this course is going to take my interview and interrogation course because I'm giving away the farm here. But as soon as they came in, within the first 10 minutes, we actually had them interviewing each other on a significant life event. I think the one we did initially was 9/11. So they'd run an interview, talk about their experience, what do they remember from 9/11. It was really, really interesting. And that was actually a form of pre-assessment, because then we went back and debriefed it and talked about, did you use, in the cognitive interviewing module, we gave you a certain number of techniques. Did you apply those techniques? Did you tell them to close their eyes? Did you tell them to think back to the day and remember everything that they could? Did you, did you actually apply all of those? Some people did, some didn't, and that was fine. The amount of recall from an online module is still somewhat limited, but it was a way to get them to apply it and then take the feedback and improve on it later. And again, it was much more effective than us standing there talking again about what was already in the online module. These are all the techniques for cognitive interviewing and how you apply them. So we used a pre-assessment, an actual exercise in order to bring everybody forward and apply all the information that we'd given them in the online module. For interrogation, we had 3 interrogation techniques that were covered in the course. And what I did, each technique, we would cover a technique. They'd give some examples. And then we would, I would do an exercise, some sort of group exercise for each technique. So they would practice. If we did one on, there was one I think on using metaphors and stories, etc. So we would do an exercise, we'd give a case study and say, so what type of metaphors or would you use in this type of interrogation or an interrogation for this specific case. So we did that for each technique. And then we did a quiz on the techniques where they recognized how they were being applied. We actually used a transcript of, if anybody doesn't know the case, of it's the Ontario case. The guy who ended up admitting to murder was Sergeant Russell, I think it was. I should remember this. I did all the design work and I've read the transcript numerous times. It was Sergeant Russell's interrogation, which is textbook if anybody hasn't seen it. So we actually had them go through a component of the transcript and identify where all the techniques were being applied so that they could see what these techniques look like in a real life interrogation. And then as a summative, we actually did full-blown scenarios where they conducted interrogations based on case studies. So this shows, this document I did before I ever even designed the course, and I'd already started developing what type of pre-assessments are we going to use, how are we going to start assessing at each level, how do we want to make sure they have it, and then what are we doing at the end, so that everything builds towards that. And so it was all very mapped out long before the course was ever, all the PowerPoints were done and the course was created. We knew exactly how we were going to assess everything. So the next section I'm going to talk about is assessment writing. So let me see here. Just thought I'd check and make sure if there's any chat going on. I think we're good. No questions? Nope. Does anyone have any questions before I move on to the next section? Oh, all right, I'll keep going. So I'm going to talk about assessment writing. And again, like I said at the beginning, this is very, very challenging. It takes a lot of practice to get good at it, and it doesn't matter how often you do it, we still have to go back and follow all of these basic principles when we're writing them. So the first part, which I talk about anytime I'm talking about instructional design, is that your test questions or your assessment needs to align to your learning outcomes. We wrote the learning outcomes based on Bloom's taxonomy. What level of learning were we in? So where do we need them to be? Do we need them to remember, understand something? Do we need them to actually apply this information? Or do we have to go up into the higher levels where we start getting into decision making and assessing different situations and applying it in multiple scenarios? And when you've written your learning outcomes like this, it should basically lay the red carpet for how you should be assessing it. So back to the interrogation course when I wrote it, really the entire goal of the course and the main learning outcome was that they would be able to conduct a legally defensible interrogation. That was our goal of the whole course, is that they could conduct an interrogation and it wouldn't get thrown out in court. Obviously, we need them to, that's higher levels. They have to be able to apply all the different techniques, and we wanted to see a demonstration of that in different situations. So we were up in evaluating and analyzing levels, and that's why we chose scenarios. Luckily, we had the budget and were able to work it out so that we could run full scenarios. Resources are always a concern, so we have to be cognizant. Sometimes full-blown scenarios are not an option because of the amount of resources. That course can only hold 16 people because of the resources we need to run those scenarios. So there's always a give and take, but we knew that they had to be up into the higher levels. I wouldn't just test them on listing the 3 techniques and telling us sort of rote memory what those techniques are. That's wrong level of learning. They would be down in remembering and understanding. and that's not appropriate for what our outcome was. So really, when you go to write your assessments, you should be looking at where you need them to be in the what level of learning you need them to be at. Sometimes, and we build up. So we talk about scaffolding and we build up. We did have a quiz where we did have them go through, and for us it was in the online component. We covered the 3 techniques, and we did have quizzes and exercises that we're remembering and understanding. Do you remember what the 3 techniques are, et cetera, sort of the basic rote memory. That's to get them up to the higher levels. So we need to make sure they have the content before they start applying it in one situation and then applying it in multiple situations. So when we're scaffolding, we're working up towards it. So you can have questions that start down in remembering and understanding, but if you need them to be up into the higher levels, make sure your assessment moves up into those higher levels of thinking and application. I've seen far too many tests and assessments that stick down into the remembering and understanding levels, even though the entire purpose of the course is to be up into the higher levels of thinking, but they don't extend their assessments to those levels. So you have to look at using case studies and real life situations and actually having them analyze situations and make decisions. Even in multiple choice, you can still have them evaluating and making decisions. It's an option. We use it for online learning when we have automated grading. So we can get up there, but you have to be far more in depth with your question types. So that'll be my first and probably most important tip, is to make sure your assessment aligns with your outcomes and with the right level of learning and where you want to be. The next tip is content. This is very interesting. I've had this discussion numerous times with different employers, especially when there's this assumed base knowledge that people should have. And I've seen a lot of test questions where the answer wasn't actually in the course anywhere. And the response I usually get is, well, they're supposed to know that. If you have something that they're supposed to know when they come into class, that's what you use a pre-assessment for. It's not fair to grade people on something that wasn't covered in your course. So I usually tell people when if I'm reviewing an assessment or looking at an existing one, is you should be able to show me where in your course content the answer is for every single question on your test. No questions of things that you think that they should know or that they should have acquired before they ever came to your course. Put those in pre-assessments if you want them to know. Pre-assessments are not graded. They're for feedback and information purposes only. So if you want to make sure that they have some piece of information that's important, then cover it up front. Don't put it in the summative assessment. It's not fair. And it's also, you have to remember when you give the feedback to somebody and say, well, you got these questions wrong, you need to be able to respond to, so how do I get better? So when they come to you and say, okay, I want to do better next time, so what do I need to study, or what sections do I need to cover again so that I can score better next time? If you can't show them where in your course they need to go to improve and score higher, then there's something wrong with your assessment. So the second rule of thumb is it must be in your course content somewhere. The response to every single question on your assessment needs to be in there. You need to be able to direct people on how to improve. This one's my favorite. I don't know where this came from, but the next tip is no trick questions. I still see this a lot. I really don't. I think this is something I think we all saw in our school years when we were coming up, that they used to write questions to make sure you really read the question carefully and that you were paying attention. And sometimes there was a word that sort of changes the response, and they're trick questions. And it goes back to, it's our job to set people up to succeed. Why would you trick somebody or be concerned about their interpretation of a single word and how they read it, instead of worrying about whether or not they met the learning objectives and are taking away the content that we needed them to take away? Don't trick people. I recently designed some courses on meetings for police commissions, and I subcontracted a piece by somebody who usually writes for post-secondary, and there was a question there about how often can somebody speak during a meeting. So it was Robert's rules we were talking about. And it says in the content that they can speak for up to 2 times for 10 minutes each time. And then when they wrote the question, they said, how long can somebody speak? And the response was up to 20 minutes. But that's not how it was worded in the content. And sure enough, when we ran the pilot group through the program, a lot of people got that question wrong. And that's because the wording of the question didn't align with the way we presented it in the content. I went and changed a lot of the questions because they were trick questions, and that serves no purpose. The response actually now says a person can speak up to 2 times, up to 10 minutes each time. So when they see that, oh yes, that was what it said in the content. I need to know whether or not they are clear on how many people can actually, how many times a person can talk during a meeting, not whether or not they can interpret 2 times up to 10 minutes. So please avoid trick questions. It's one of my goals, to just stop people from doing this. We're not out to trick people. We are there to help people succeed. Oh good, I just got a message from somebody else, so I'm watching the chat, saying, from Sarah, saying that she's very glad to hear that. I've seen a lot of this, and it's a strange mindset. I don't really understand where it comes from, about this, I'm going to trick them and I'm going to get them because they didn't quite read the question correctly. I'm not sure what their purpose is or why anybody would want to do that. I don't ever do that. I'm very clear and direct in my questions. So avoid the trick questions. We don't want them. We're not here to trick people. So next one I'm just going to talk about is language. And again, I'm going to reiterate again, this is really, it takes a lot of time to get good at this. When you're writing test questions, be very clear and concise about, make your questions very short, to try to use short sentences, be very concise with what you're saying. And again, align it with what's in the content. A lot of time I word it exactly the same as it's in the content. So be very clear, use plain language or the language that's in your content. But I've seen ones where they get very big into whereas and therefore, and they start using sort of this big terminology. The test isn't the place for that. We want to be as plain language and clear as we possibly can. This one I think is interesting. I came across this one when I was doing more research for this. They talk about using direct questions. So what they mean is actually ask a question. Don't write your test questions like a sentence continuation. So at the end of this, how would you actually assess somebody at the end of a test, and then start listing at the end of a course, and then start listing your responses with a written test, with a scenario, that's sort of considered a sentence extension, I guess I'll call it. And what their research was saying was that people have trouble, their brain has trouble getting around that, the whole sentence extension thing. Actually ask a question. How would you test in this type of course for summative assessment? Question mark. And then the answers are using a written test, using a scenario, etc. So what the research said was use very direct questions with a question mark. Don't sort of do the sentence extension. If you need to, you can use fill in the blank, especially when you're doing terminology, but whenever possible, try to ask an actual question. I guess it has to do with the way the brain functions and how they read the question, but they interpret it much easier if it's actually in the form of a question instead of just a sentence with a bunch of extended answers. No double negatives. This one's always interesting, and I'm sure everybody's run across this, where you actually start wrapping your head around in circles trying to figure out what the question's asking you. I've seen this a lot. It's usually caused by double negatives. So an example would be, what shouldn't you do in a meeting? And A is don't be late. B is don't interrupt. So now you've used shouldn't as a negative in the question and then don't or not in the answer. It gets very, very confusing, and you start trying to wrap your head around what shouldn't I do? What should I do? Am I not supposed to? And it gets very confusing. So you have to be very careful for double negatives. and you see them a lot. So if you have a negative in the question and a negative in the answer, it gets very hard for them to interpret what it is you're trying to ask them. One I didn't put on here for a common question type that we use fairly often that we shouldn't use as much as we do, but for true-false questions, when you write them, it shouldn't be a question. It should be a statement. A summative assessment is at the end of a topic or course, true or false. So you're asking them, here's a statement. Is this statement true or is this statement false? And that's how I think of it when I write true or false questions, is make a statement and then you can actually write out, is this true or false? Again, I've seen it done in the form of a question and it gets very confusing. Again, I'm very literal, I guess, when I'm reading questions and reading things. And so sometimes I see where it causes a lot of confusion just in the style of question and the way that it was written. So true, false should be a statement. Avoid double negatives. Sometimes it's hard because that's the type of question you're asking, but you have to maybe look at rewording your question so that it starts with a positive and then use negatives in the response, or the other way around. Be plain, be very clear and concise so that people really understand what it is you're saying. All right. Good. Sarah also just made another comment about assigning evaluations. And she is correct. Assessment is a form of evaluation. So all of these tips also go if you're writing surveys or doing any sort of evaluations of that type. All of these types of things, all of this advice and the tips, they apply as well when you're writing evaluations, especially survey questions, because we run into the same problems with survey questions. So the question types, I divided this up for the different types of learning in case I had anybody here who was more e-learning specialist. I just want to talk about, so when we're looking at what types of assessment we're going to do and what question types, obviously when we're online, we're usually using some sort of automated grading system. It is possible to submit essays through online formats and do some form of grading. It's not something I spend a lot of time in because I'm not overly confident in the ability of a computer to grade an essay, but I would like to try it out sometime in the future. So far, I've stuck to sort of very rote testing methods and use these types of question types. True or false, like I mentioned, just try to make a statement and say whether it's true. This is very, very low level thinking, so you should be down in sort of remembering level if you're using true or false questions. Sometimes we use them just to sort of, I use them more to reiterate an important point. If there's something I really didn't want them to forget, usually something legislation based, I'll use a true or false question. I just want to be very clear that they know, especially if there's something we really don't want them to do. This is sort of a reiteration. There's a 50-50 chance they're going to get it right, so it's not a great form of actually assessing knowledge. Multiple choice is most common. It's the one I use the most. And one of the hardest, of course, and we use it all the time. Writing multiple choice questions, we need to really think about the wrong answers more than the right answer. I mean, it's easy to just go and write a question and then write the answer right out of the content, but how do we get wrong answers that will actually test their knowledge is very tricky to do and takes a lot of practice again. So when I write multiple choice questions, I always look at is there a common error that's associated to whatever it is I'm writing the question on? If it is, then I want to put the common error in as one of the response options because we're trying to correct any sort of common errors. So if there's a decision that's commonly made incorrectly out on the job, that's something we want to work into our multiple choice. Otherwise, we want to make sure that the responses are all of similar length. I've seen the ones and it's always a dead giveaway when one answer is really, really long because they're putting in all of the content and making sure they cover the entire procedure, and then the three other answers are really short. that's a giveaway. And in essence, you haven't tested anything. If you're giving away the answer, then there is no assessment going on. You're just basically paying lip service to it. So make sure they're similar length, that the wrong answers are still feasible. You really want to push them to think their way through this and actually apply the information through a multiple choice. And if they're just guessing, that there's a good shot that they'll get it wrong. It's important. We need to make sure that they are taking away the information and meeting the learning outcomes. And if we don't write our test properly, to actually push them to test the knowledge, then we have no idea when they walk out whether they knew it, didn't know it, and then we can't correct it. And unfortunately, for all of us who work in job training, we find out after the fact when something has gone wrong, that there was an error in our training. And part of it is that we didn't catch it on the assessment and provide feedback and guidance to fix that before they left the classroom. So you really have to work hard at multiple choice questions and getting those wrong answers to make sure that they're good enough that you really are pushing them to think through it. Multiple response, that's the select all that apply. This one I've learned through trial and error and a lot of feedback, and it's tough to get right. It seems easy when you're writing the question because the answers are right in front of you. It's very challenging for our participants when they write these questions. What I've done a lot of time with multiple responses, I tell them how many responses are correct. Try and give them a little hand with this. If you're listing 6 things and 4 of them are right, then say select the 4 that apply or select the 4 correct answers. At least then you've given them some hint, because when they're just staring at 6 answers and they don't really know how many they're supposed to be looking at, it sort of causes a lot of confusion, and they get very frustrated with those question types. They're hard questions. So you have to know you are sort of amping up the stress level with those types of questions, and try and give them a hand if it's appropriate. I found that's worked much better, and I've gotten a lot less negative feedback when I at least tell them how many are right. The other challenge with multiple response is how are you going to grade it? Do they have to get all of them right in order to get it right? What if they get 3 out of the 4? Then do they get a half mark, or is it out of 4 marks, or is the whole thing out of 1 mark? So it can be quite tricky figuring out how you're going to grade multiple response. What happens if they get 2 right and 2 wrong? Do they just get 0? Are you going to subtract for the ones that they got wrong? So these ones are a little bit more complex in the grading aspect. Usually I just give 1 mark and it's either right or wrong, but I don't use this question type a lot unless I have a very specific list of things and I want to make sure that they understand the list or the what applies to the procedure, etc. I'll use them, but I use them sparingly because of the frustration with the way that they're written. Sorting questions, I use these a lot online because they're really handy where they can pick it up and put stuff in order. Obviously, this is really good for procedures, anything with a very specific order. How are they going to go about something? We can use sorting questions. And now, because of all the great software we have for designing online learning, all of these things are relatively easy to do. I also do matching. So if we have a definition and then the word that's being defined, I'll have them connect. I use that a lot in theories. So when I'm explaining a theory, then I'll give an example and say, so which theory is this that's being applied? And I'll actually have them match the example to the theory. And then the other one is fill in the blank. Again, especially if you're using computer graded testing, they have to get the answer exactly right. I know I've had one where there's been spelling errors and then people come back, they're kind of angry because they slightly spelled something wrong, and then they got the question wrong, but they actually knew the information. So fill in the blank, again, it's something I use very sparingly. When it's terminology that's understood by everybody and needs to be understood exactly the same, then go ahead and use fill in the blank. But it's something I don't use very often at all. All right, Sarah, I'm going to get to your question a little bit further down. I'll see if I can address that for online learning specifically. She's just asking about platforms for online testing. So there is some good options there as far as testing. Again, fill in the blank, I don't use it very often. It's sort of tricky and it kind of upsets people. You could use it in the form of a multiple choice, is a bit better. If you want to get out of spelling issues, then just give them different options and they can select which one fits in there. Classroom, obviously we have a lot more options, but again, we have to keep in mind our resources and what's available. I've done some courses like the investigation course where they hand in a full binder at the end of their investigation for the scenario that we presented. And it takes us weeks to actually get through and mark them all. And we have to have all of the resources available to do that. So you have to bear in mind what your resources are and what your time frame is afterwards for marking, etc. If sometimes it's a little bit better to do some of these things more as a formative assessment where you do have time to go through and then give feedback and have them grow from that, and then do something that's a little more standard for the summative. If we have to do certificates and get them graduated right away and finishing the course, we may not have time to go and mark all these things afterwards. So just a suggestion, sometimes you may want to use some of these more for formative and not so much for summative. But our options in the classroom, we can have people write essays, which are great when you're in the affective domain, when you're dealing with beliefs and ethics and all that sort of stuff. Essays are usually a great way to go where people can take a position and defend their position, and they can apply the content and why they would make the decision they would. Presentations are often used. We'll get up and talk about what you know. Demonstrations, obviously we use this a lot, especially in law enforcement. I think of more the hands-on techniques. Even EVOC, they're based on demonstration. You have to pass the test. Firearms is based on demonstration. So that one we use a lot. And that's obviously the application level. So we've taught you something. Can you show us what we taught you back? Case-based is more around a scenario like the investigation I was talking about. So we would give them a piece of information and then they'd have to write the report and state what they would do for the investigation. That's all case-based. All the scenarios that we use, even for interrogation, are all real cases because it's far easier to take something that exists than it is for us to sit down and draft from scratch. So those are all case-based. So we're using real-life situations and then assessing their response to those situations and whether or not it's based on what we taught them. Role-playing is obviously when we're getting into interactions, and especially human interactions or decision-making, tactics, all that sort of stuff. We use scenarios, or role-playing I consider a little bit more, less with all of the dealing with the environment around you. To me, that's a scenario. Role-playing is a little more like two people are just going to sit down and talk. I did a lot of this when I used to, way back in the beginning of my career, do call center training. Obviously, we did a lot of role-playing when they called in and pretended to be customers and they helped each other and used the system. And so we did a fair bit of role-playing. Usually role-playing is more formative and it's practice, so they try something out and figure out what they know and what they don't know, and it's all done. Their scenarios tend to be more, they can be formative, that'd be great. A lot of time we use them for summative, so we go and assess them at the end. Performing, and that's obviously scenarios are the higher level assessment, decision-making type things. I'm going to talk a little bit about conditions. I just laugh because I just love this picture, because this picture reminds me of the number of arguments I've had about allowing for open book exams and how many times people have told me I'm crazy for advocating for them. So for me, it's all about the conditions. Again, it all goes back to learning outcomes. What is it we want them to be able to do at the end of the course? And I've seen a lot of rote memory testing that really wasn't necessary. I've seen stuff where we'll do a test and they have to know which section of the criminal code these types of charges are in. And my question back to them always was, yeah, but when they're on the job, don't they have their criminal code accessible? Well, yeah, they do. So why are we forcing them to memorize something that they don't need to memorize when they're out on the job? You're just causing undue stress again. And I think it's more important that they are able to use the criminal code and find the information when they need it. And they're far more comfortable with that book than I am worried about them memorizing a couple of sections and where they might be. To me, it's more important that they can use the table of contents, quickly find what sections they need, and figure out what charges they want to lay, than the fact that we had them memorize whatever form, whatever section of the CDSA, etc. Now, if we're dealing in charter rights, sorry for all my American friends, I'm sure you're very familiar anyways, very same as what you guys have, but our own version. And so when we're dealing with something like Charter 10B, which is giving rights when you're doing an interview, then maybe we do need them to memorize that. In what case, we're not going to give them access to the charter to read. They need to know that 10B is the section that applies. So you really have to look at the conditions and what it is you want them to be able to do at the end, and follow that whenever possible. Obviously, for testing purposes, we don't usually allow them to do it in groups. You may want to consider when you're in presentations, scenarios, etc., allowing them to work as a team, because that's how they're going to work out in the field. But there are other times where we do need to make sure that each individual has the knowledge that we need, and warrant drafting was one. There's no reason when they're drafting a warrant that they can't call somebody and say, hey, can you help me with this? But for the purpose of the warrant drafting course, we needed to know every person who was in there could draft a warrant comfortably with their own knowledge without accessing help. But on the other side, they did have full access to their criminal code, where all the templates are, and anything else that they would normally have access to when they're creating one. If you're worried about open book and their usability, obviously we don't want them sitting there on the job flipping through the criminal code page by page trying to figure out what it is they need. That's when you start looking at implementing time limits. So we need to know that you're efficient in using this document. That's when we would use a time limit, which I did when I designed a call center test for people who went on our support team. So they took the most escalated calls. They had to be very, very good in policy and procedure, because they helped all the call center agents and took the highest calls. And so what we did was we wrote the test questions based on the policies and procedures. They were allowed to access them because they're allowed to access them when they're working, but we needed to make sure that they were very efficient in knowing which policies and procedures that they had to access when. So we created the test. I took some of my top support team agents and ran them through, and we timed them how long it would take. And that was what we used. And then we gave a bit of leeway because they're new. And so basically you had to finish the test in 30 minutes. And if you didn't know your way through your policies and procedures, you wouldn't get through in time. So if you're worried about the use of documentation, that's where you want to start implementing stricter time limits. If not, then consider the conditions they'll be using on the job. This is really, really important stuff. And it always fascinates me how many times I have to have this discussion with clients and with people about allowing open book exams. And it goes back to that tricking people and setting them up to fail, which it's a mindset I really don't understand at all. I want my people to succeed. I want everybody to leave the training with what we needed them and to go on and succeed. And I'm going to try to do everything I can to set you up to get you there. So conditions are really important. So the last section I'm just going to talk about is grading. So how do we assess some of these? Obviously, the computer-based ones are easy. We know how to grade those because they're auto-graded, and it's very clear this is right, this is wrong, etc. But when we get into the higher levels, into essays, presentations, all of that sort of stuff, grading gets far more complex. And going back to the very beginning, this is part of our requirements. So we have to make sure that we're very clear and fair in how we grade people. So this is an example of a rubric that I did. So this is for the warrant drafting course that I created. So we went and looked at, and this time for the beginning, we just went with you either did it or you didn't. This you can actually do as a checklist, which is what we did for those interrogation scenarios. We had a checklist. Did you apply this technique? Yes or no? Did you apply the second technique? Yes or no? And as they were doing the scenarios, they would just assess it and check, yes, you did, and then they would write comments afterwards. So it was either yes or no. So this shows the did you meet expectations or didn't you? Then we get into another section of scoring. So what do we consider excellent, good, fair, and poor? And I assure you, this document took a long time to write. A lot of discussion went into each one of these categories. You know, did you establish your grounds for your warrant properly? Or were you incomplete when you disclosed information? So I worked very, very closely with our subject matter experts when we designed this. And so they went through and decided basically what worked for each one. So those are rubrics. You can do them checklist or scoring. They're a really, really important part of being able to fairly grade and give feedback, which is my last section. Feedback's very, very important. It is the entire basis of assessing. In order for them to learn, you need to give them feedback. So even when you're writing the summative assessment, make sure you design it so that you have time in order for everybody to at least see their exam and see what they got wrong and learn from their mistakes. It's a very powerful form of learning, obviously very good for formative because then they get another shot at it. We test them, they try something, they get it wrong, we give them feedback, then they try it again. Hopefully they get it right. If not, they get it wrong, they get more feedback, then we try it again. Feedback is really where all learning happens. The key is reflection, so they need time to sit and think about what happened and assess what their feedback is and then have the opportunity to apply it again. So really this is the underlying theory of why assessments are so powerful. And when you think back to that standardized testing as kids, we never got to see that exam again. So we had no idea how we did. So there was no learning based on that, which is part of the reason why I can't stand standardized testing in school kids. So it's something I feel very strongly about because it's not doing anything to improve their education or their learning. And this is one of the biggest reasons why, because they never get to see how they did. If you're worried about your exams getting out, hand them out and then have everybody hand them back before they go. But don't let them leave the room without seeing their feedback. And then, so this is just the final, more about the process, is try and pilot, make sure you pilot your tests over and over. Get as many subject matter experts, people you know, to write your test and give you feedback on it. It doesn't matter how many times you did this, you're still gonna word things that it's kind of confusing, they don't really understand what you were saying. Even if you run a pilot class, make sure you get all your statistics. You should be able to, especially if you're using computer-based, you'll be able to see how they responded to every question, and you'll see right away if there's one question that most people are getting wrong. That's probably your fault. It's either your fault in the design or it's your fault in the way that you wrote the test question. I can't stress enough, I know a lot of people put their tests out there and they haven't really piloted them. Pilot it as much as you possibly can. At least have 3 people write the test and give you feedback. Don't hand them the test with all the responses and say, hey, what do you think? Because that really doesn't test them and doesn't take them through it until they actually experience it for themselves. And then they'll be able to tell you, this question really doesn't make any sense to me. I don't really know what you were asking. And that's the only way to find it out. And I don't know anybody who can write a perfect test the first go around. So you have to be really open to this process, but take the time and pilot your tests. And even with your first pilot class, usually they know they're a pilot group, so ask them for feedback on the test and what they thought about it and what they thought about the test questions. So that's all of my content. Just a quick, for anybody who didn't watch the last webinar, I do have a full 5-module online program. It's all asynchronous, so you just load up and do the modules anytime you want. And you can work through all of the different stages of instructional design. Basically, I created a program based on what I would have liked when I first started. So if you're interested in that, you can find it on my website. And like I did with my last webinar, I offered 25% off until Friday, which happens to be Canada Day for all of my other Canadian friends, but it'll still be valid all day. So one of the questions Sarah asked was suggestions for online test platforms. If you want to do one in the classroom and it's free, I can always send it out in email afterwards. It's called Socrative, S-O-C-R-A-T-I-V-E, Socrative.com. It's free, and it's actually an online platform, but you can go and create a quiz in advance, multiple choice, etc. You can actually send it out, and everybody with a web-enabled device can log in and put their name in there. They answer the questions and hit submit, and you actually get a full Excel spreadsheet of how they responded to all of the questions. So free documentation, you don't have to sit there scoring and marking anything. You do have to write the test. That one's really, really common, is excellent and free for classroom courses, especially formative or even pre-assessments, because it gives you, the instructor, a sense of where everybody's at, and you can have it set so that they get feedback and they know that they got it right or wrong, or you can debrief it. But that's one that I've used in the classroom. Online platforms are a little bit harder because now you're into a learning management system. If you want to get any sort of feedback, Moodle is probably the most common free platform that can be used. I haven't used it a lot for testing. I use it a lot for course hosting, so I'd have to get into it. My courses have assessments built into it, but I use LearnDash, which I purchased, and it puts everything through a learning record system so that I get reporting on how everybody scored on the test, and I can set pass marks, etc. So those are a few suggestions. You really have to kind of Google learning management systems and see what's out there. I haven't looked really for testing specifically for online because all of mine are built in, but hopefully that helps. Any other questions? You have 2 minutes. And I wasn't sure I'd be able to fill up all the time. It's amazing how fast it goes. No, there we go. I just realized the slide didn't say. So there's the my website and the coupon code till Friday, and that's everything for me. I've recorded this, so I will put it up on YouTube like I did last time and make it available for anybody who wasn't able to make it. I know I had somebody else last time who had to dial in so they couldn't see the visuals, so it gives them an opportunity to go through and watch it again. So thanks everyone for coming and spending an hour and talking about assessments. I hope it was useful.